Okay, y'all. So there are now three things I would like to talk about tonight. One is whether or not Tom is a sympathetic character. Number two, I want to talk about scientific humanism. And number three, I want to talk about love. That'll be nice. So, okay. Y'all, that's a great question. Do you think Tom is a sympathetic character? Now, when we talk about that in literature, sympathetic character means it's a character whose motivation you can understand and kind of get behind.
That back door there, there's some people playing basketball in there, I think. So we probably could.
Look, Bob's just trying to get in.
I think he's a sympathetic character, but I also think part of it is because he's the first person narrator.
All right, talk about that. That's a really good answer, Don.
Well, you not only see his actions, but you understand his motivations, and he comes across as being very honest about himself, including his own foibles.
Okay, that's really good. That is, on some level, well, okay, so this is where you get into that reliability of the narrator. If you think Tom is trying to be honest, then that might make him a sympathetic character. What else would make him sympathetic, y'all? Because I agree. I don't know. For today's reading, I did feel that he was sympathetic, but that doesn't mean he's not crude in his thinking and what he reveals to you all as readers. What else makes him sympathetic?
But any doctor that sits there and drinks all day long and asks his nurse not to bring in any patients, that's not a very sympathetic character. I mean, if we're balancing the scales here, I mean, he's living off his wife's money, and he's not doing a lick at a snake. And so I guess that
I agree. I totally think you are right.
You would have uncoupled out of that practice, wouldn't you?
I'd have been on 24/7 with old Tom, sitting back there not rowing the boat with me.
So y'all, I think that is problematic, right? That, and in the section that we read for tonight, there's also that position where, on the one hand, people keep trying to make him be a doctor, but he doesn't really want to practice. And at the same time, we find out that he's the only one, as far as we see, who will actually go into the swamp and help people.
Yeah, he treats the baby and saves the baby's life. So yeah. That made him sympathetic, but he's got an awful lot on the other side of the ledger, was all I was saying.
I could not agree more. And the thing about Tom that makes him so difficult is that first person narration, in the sense that, he tells us maybe way too much about what he's thinking and who he is. When he's explaining how he's trying to set up these different love nests in the old Howard Johnsons. Yes. I would like to say I'm thrilled to have an audience that has actually heard of a Howard Johnson. That's thrilling. But also, he gives us a sense of the kind of prurient things he thinks about these women that don't make him very attractive to us. So I think he's a really difficult character in terms of determining, is he a hero in this novel? Well, we can't tell yet. Is he a sympathetic character in the novel? But that kind of slides us into, what do you think is wrong with him, y'all? Let's see if we can articulate what we think is wrong with Tom.
I just got a B- in high school psychology, but he comes across to me as a little bit paranoid.
Totally paranoid. Very good. What else?
Well, he's a bad alcoholic. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, y'all are exactly right. Okay, so he's a paranoid alcoholic. What
Mhm.
else? Because this is at the heart of the novel, y'all. How did he get that way? What's wrong with him?
Had a little girl die.
And his wife left him. Yeah.
Okay,
For 2 English
He's a
marriages.
bad Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Oh my gosh, finally, I have a Zoom class that's getting me. Okay, good. Yeah. So here are the things you have to factor in. Number one is the loss of this child, Samantha. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Because he's consistently kind of setting up for you the before and after, right? That before Samantha's illness, which is awful and vile and grotesque. But before her illness, he sort of is this man who at least feels that he's at peace. He goes to church, it means something to him. He has this marriage that gives him some kind of happiness, and he has this child. And the way that he kind of describes his time with Samantha is just beautiful, you know, when he'll say things like, oh, this is where I read Ricky Tikki Tavi to her. And so you go, and this is an issue throughout American literature and in, quite frankly, some of our lives. How do you recover from the loss of a child? What, I mean, how do you even wrap your mind around it? And so the Tom we have before her death is completely different from the Tom we get July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Yes? And what about that marriage? Let's talk about that marriage. What was that like?
She's the apple queen from the Shenandoah Valley.
Could you not love that more? Yes, and he keeps referring to her that way. Did he have a successful relationship before the death of his child?
Well, when she left, she wasn't very complimentary. She said, you know, that he didn't talk to her and that it was just lust and sex and no connection. So she certainly fired all the cannons as she was going out the door.
Yeah, even though she's willing to have sex on her way out the door.
Yeah.
With him.
One
Which
last
is-
time.
And so even though this novel in a lot of ways is, you know, apocalyptic, futuristic, totally unreal, the human relationships, I think, are so effective in the sense that what does his wife see as the problem in this marriage? Because that's a big deal, y'all.
Well,
Do
he
you
didn't-
know?
She talks to him, and that what she says as she was leaving, that he was just there. He didn't.
No communication.
Yeah, no communication. Yeah.
Right. No communication. What else? What's the difference, does she say? I'm pushing you.
Okay.
So in my book, I'm on page 64. I have this one, which is, it's only a couple of pages into July 1st. Let's look at it together and see if we can articulate this. So first he tells you what Doris's favorite books are. Siddhartha, Atlas Shrugged, ESP, and The New Spirituality, which is my favorite list ever. Books matter. My poor wife Doris was ruined by books and a heathen Englishman, not by dirty books, but by clean books, not by depraved books, but by spiritual books. My wife, who began life as a cheerful Episcopalian from Virginia, became a priestess of the high places. I loved her dearly and loved to lie with her, and would and did whenever she would allow it. Beware of Episcopal women who take up Ayn Rand and the Buddha and Dr. Ryan, formerly of Duke University. So, y'all, what is this boy talking about?
Sue, from the guy's point of view, this is just the guy's point of view.
All right.
Or let me rephrase that. One, I don't speak for all of male humanity. I just speak for me.
I know, because John Bailey just had like a little moment when you said you're speaking for all guys.
That sounds
What do you think, Hank?
that sounds pretextual to me, Sue.
What do you think, Hank? What's he saying?
I think it's pretextual. That's the way I hear it. I think she's looking to leave, and she's going to do what a lot of human beings have done since the dawn of time. I'm going to blame it on somebody else.
All right. Look.
Also, Sue, if you go back to that Kierkegaardian analysis you talked about earlier about the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious,
Yes.
she's clearly stuck in that middle place.
Yep.
Yes.
And go ahead, Richard. I didn't mean to step on you.
Richard,
No.
explain that, because I think you're dead on. What are you saying?
Well, Tom is obviously at times is stuck in the aesthetic sphere, where all he cares about is drinking and having sex, so forth and so on. And Doris kind of looks down on him and thinks a better way. But they fall prey to Gnostic pride. You know, it's that thinking, I don't need God. You know, I can figure all this out by myself. You know, and that's what she's done with Ayn Rand and the Buddha and Dr. Ryan, formerly of Duke University.
Yeah.
And Richard and Sue, I wonder too, given when this was written, those kind of movements were happening within, a lot of our mainline churches. Folks were moving, into those other areas that we now would almost call, new age. And so if he's taken on some of that, that's part of it. That really good insight, Richard. Thanks.
Herman Hesse and Siddhartha was very big in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Yes. And y'all, still, this is a joke in the English department, because when we ask our English majors, hey, what are your favorite books? 8 out of 10 of them will say Ayn Rand. And we all, it's like a total joke in the department, because, and then later we find out, one of his girlfriends loves Rod McEwen, and we all just sort of giggle and go, oh, they just have some ways to go, but there's something that's so attractive about those kinds of writers to people who are searching for something, right? And so here's the thing. What Doris tries to tell Tom is, as you all say, that kind of very new agey declaration when she says, I'm going in search of myself. And in some ways, you have to kind of read her carefully because, and I think this goes directly to what Richard's saying, how she's sort of in that aesthetic phase where she'll say, here's the thing, Tom, we don't communicate. And then she says, we're so dead inside. And I don't think she's wrong. The death of that child has alienated both of them, not just from themselves, but from each other. And, you know, the death of a child is one, like, I think only 20% of marriages survive the death of a child
Wow.
because of grief. And what I mean is, and I think in some ways we have to talk about this in order for Tom to maybe move forward. And that is, no matter who you are as an individual and who we are perhaps as couples, people grieve individually. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a very lonely, separating kind of place. And Tom's way is to completely revert into the pleasure principle. Yes, everything has to be physical and sort of concrete. And for Doris, she wants to, she says, take this spiritual journey. And this is so Walker Percy, and this is how the book kind of attaches to us. Her journey doesn't seem to include Christ. And why is that, y'all?
Well,
Because
the hardest question anybody ever asks a Christian is about suffering.
yes,
There's no good answer to that. You know, I mean, either God isn't omnipotent, or else he would have fixed it, or else he is omnipotent and just doesn't care, in which case, who can follow that kind of a God? You know,
right.
you got to get through that. And so they both go in different directions. She's like, she says at some point, find God you got there. You know, I mean,
Yes.
after the tumor is pushed their daughter's eye out, it's like
Yes.
painting. She says, great God that you got there to let something like this happen, you know? And he's going way into the aesthetic, you know, wine, women, and song. Tomorrow we die.
You are dead on. Yeah. I mean, what happens to Doris, and we don't really get enough information from Tom. You know, she was a good Episcopalian. That's what we know. But we don't get a sense, like we do with Tom, that the rituals of the Catholic Church actually meant something to him. That he did appreciate or embrace the whole idea of the Eucharist and communion. We don't get that information. That's a problem with first person narration. We don't get a sense of what Christianity might have meant to her before. But what we know is, he says, I'm on page 67 in my book, that she joined the Unity Church, got in the habit of putting up English lecturers of various Oriental persuasions, Brahmin, Buddhist, Sikh. And then he says, two things Doris loved, the English people and Eastern religion. And so what she kind of makes clear to him, at least in the way that she can describe it, is that she's some kind of spiritual seeker, and she is a pilgrim of some kind, and she says that Tom is not. And that leads to kind of this central problem in the novel, which is, do you think Tom loves her? Most critics argue that the major theme running through this novel is connected to love. when we meet Tom at the beginning of the novel and through much of it, he is consistently talking about physical love and lust and gratification. And so it's all about the concrete pleasure for him. But remember the first time, I get these women mixed up, which is sad. It makes me Tom-like. Do you remember? Oh, the first time we get this introduction to Lola and they have sex on the, golf course. But
So in
what
the
does he?
Sand trap, yeah.
Yeah, and what does he call her?
He calls her Doris.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that Walker Percy is really trying to push us to define is, what do you think love is? It's the hardest question on the planet, yes?
Mhm.
What is it? I mean, do you think he loves Doris?
I don't know that he can love anybody. That's just,
Why, Hank?
he just seems so solipsistic, just so wrapped up in himself. And I'm not saying I don't recognize me in that. I'm not saying that. Let's be real careful with our facts here. But yeah.
Or are you saying, Hank, even further, he can't love because he doesn't love himself?
Yes.
Okay.
And is, part of, I think it's later in the book, Sue, where he talks about, I looked in all these pretty women,
Yes.
and, I don't want to throw away that line too early, but isn't essentially this notion, when we get to that religious stage, we understand that we're loved and therefore have a capacity to love. So at this point, his inability to love himself means that he's hamstrung in any of these relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So
Doesn't a lot of this have to do with control issues?
Wait, say that again, Donovan.
I'm just thinking about control and his need to control and his idea that he can see the world as it should be. She moves to Ian Rand, which seems like it's more about control and
Yes.
all that kind of thing, and that love is not something that is controlled or can be controlled.
Yeah, beautiful. And y'all, part of what is so difficult with Tom is that we have Tom now as opposed to who Tom was before his child dies, and we get into this sort of apocalyptic situation. But one of the things I'm going to ask you to think about, and we have to, moving forward, really try to explain this is, and I think Guy is 100% right. Do you have to love yourself? Of course, that's on every, bad quotation calendar ever, that you have to love yourself before you can love others. But essentially the question becomes, well, what does that even mean? Love is this word we can sit. I mean, this is kind of Kierkegaard and Walker. It's an abstraction, right? Can any of us really explain what love, like real love, is? And then how does that connect to, because I think we have to move this way, how does that connect to this idea of the love of Christ?
I've always thought 1 Corinthians 13 gave you a pretty good idea. Love is kind. Love is, in essence, everything I don't seem to be. But
okay, I love that answer because, We all use that at our weddings, don't we?
Well, I think one of the things that Percy does, because it's so hard to talk about an abstraction like what is love.
Yes.
So I think he spends a lot of time talking about what love isn't. And he presents this dichotomy of angelism and bestialism. He uses
Yeah.
his books. And neither one of those is where the love of God is, you know?
Yes.
And so Doris goes off in this airy fairy, angelic kind of way, loses total touch with the concrete world, and she's up there in her head somewhere. And Tom kind of goes the other way after the daughter dies. He's immersed in the world and can't bring himself to think about anything beyond that. I can't help but always come up with a Frederick Beacon line. Somewhere he says, implicit in the commandment that we love our neighbors as ourselves is the commandment that we love ourselves, not in a selfish way, but in a way of taking care of ourselves and respecting ourselves and so forth. Because if you don't have that going for you, you don't have anything to give anybody else.
Richard, I've missed you so much.
I just compare favorably to 18-year-olds who are reading Ayn Rand and Rod McEwen.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And how many times does he sort of set up as if he sees the world in those dichotomies, right? Angel and beast. And I just want to put it in your wheelhouse because this is so Walker Percy, this idea of here's the danger that these things that are supposed to elevate us, that are supposed to make our lives authentic, do become abstractions that we can't define, that we can't sort of execute in our real lives. And I do think at some point we have to think about, and I think Dana's right, you know, Corinthians does give us this beautiful definition of love, but then we have to think about, okay, is that what we mean when we talk about the love of Christ? So let's get to this because I think it connects to what Richard was just saying. And you see this throughout the novel, but certainly in this section that you read for tonight. So we have to think about Tom's marriage, and we have to think about the way in which he is coping with grief as opposed to, well, I don't even know if coping is the right word, the way he reacts to the loss of his child versus his wife who thinks she's on a spiritual journey. But Walker Percy fundamentally believed that one of, if not the most difficult problem that we face in the modern world, in the 20th and now 21st century, is scientific humanism. What is that? Do you know?
I mean, that's another one of those Gnostic things where we think we can figure out all the answers on our own and we don't really need God. And so you got Walker Percy, and Uncle Will picked out a career for each of the three boys, and he decided Walker was going to be the doctor. So he sends him off to Chapel Hill to study chemistry. And he goes on to the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, becomes a doctor. And you know, probably in the movie where he talks about, he says, there was a time when I thought that I could eventually figure everything out. I was just kind of working on it. And at some point, he says, the problem is, and he quotes, I can't remember now, is it Hegel or Kant, somebody, he says he designed a complete philosophical system that explained everything in the world. The only problem being he himself was left over. You know, it didn't really, there wasn't a place for him, and that was constructed in his head.
Yeah. And the other thing in terms of that relationship between Walker Percy and his uncle is that, and this kind of fits exactly into this, is that he always saw his uncle as the stoic
Right.
who just sort of takes it without offering anything beyond himself. And I think all of this plays into Tom Moore. And Richard's right. Okay, so scientific humanism in its easiest definition is a philosophy. It is a way of life in which people embrace human reason, secular ethics, but it rejects religious dogma, anything supernatural, anything superstitious. But in practice, scientific humanism believes in the incremental improvement and understanding. And so it's this assertion that we can be good and ethical without God. And ultimately, the question is, do you think that's right?
No,
Richard says no. All right. Come on, Donovan. I know you're sick. I feel bad. Say no.
Well, I think it's part of maybe what empowered the social gospel was a yes to that.
Right.
Yes.
yes.
Yes. So one of the things you kind of have to grapple with in this section of the novel is, okay, is Tom someone who embraces this idea of scientific humanism? And you see the way it kind of presents himself in all the people around him, right? All the doctors. But listen, Tom fundamentally believes he's created this machine that's going to not only diagnose, but cure people of all of their sense of depression and alienation and malaise.
Please.
So is Tom a scientific humanist or not that?
I don't think he is. I think that's just sarcasm. He's just talking out of the other side of his mouth. I think he probably loves Doris, but they've lost a child and nobody has any ground to stand on. And power, nobody has any power. That's kind of a groundless point.
Yeah, good. I mean, on some level, what's so difficult, I think, for all of us is, of course, this inexplicable understanding of suffering and evil. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the human condition, right? How do we square suffering, especially for seemingly good people? How do we square that with this idea of God and Christ? And there are lots of ways we try to kind of put that in an ordered system by telling ourselves that, if we didn't have suffering, we wouldn't have joy. And if we didn't have suffering is some kind of lesson for us, some kind of test. But if we get real about it, suffering is terrible, isn't it? And this inexplicable grief of losing a child you love in such a grotesque, horrible way. Can you blame Tom or any of the other characters for sort of going into this space where they're trying to explain it all and discover it all and come up with these scientific or more concrete ways of explaining what happens to us in this journey. Remember, part of what's going on, Tom says, in Doris's philosophy or her search, is this idea that evil doesn't really exist, which is sort of the transcendental Emerson definition of evil, that evil isn't concrete and working in the universe. It's simply the absence of good. I mean, what do we do with that, preachers? Guy, Donovan, what do we do with a statement like that? That evil is simply the absence of good.
Hey, you want to take that on?
The preachers remain silent.
I think they're being smart. Yes, they're being silent.
Yeah, I mean, part of what, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that that's a very helpful answer.
Right.
You know, there are plenty of answers that may be true, but are not pastorally helpful. So
That's a great line.
yeah.
It seems as though you've got to define good to know
Yes.
what evil is.
Yes.
So you can't, you got to, it's kind of like you say someone is completely immoral. And I'm sitting there, no, he's amoral. He has no idea what the morals are. He wasn't taught whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, let's say murder is evil, but you've got to appreciate life.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to go to evil is the lack of control again.
Oh, nice.
I still think it's what we're dealing with is trying to figure out how to control our environments.
Yeah. Yeah. Scientific humanism is a very naturalistic philosophy, which is this philosophy that develops in the late 19th century that argues that we have no control, Donovan. We're simply sort of buffered about by environmental and biological forces. And you're absolutely right. What it comes down to is this idea that as humans, we have choices, or that there's at least an attempted ability to control.
Well, now that's not what my Bible teaches about.
What?
My Bible says that there is an evil personification that drives evil, and it drives it through all of us, but it is not necessarily a human deficiency. It's the devil.
Oh,
So
finally, John Bailey and my Baptist upbringing have come together. Yeah, and John, as we continue and we get the introduction of this other character, Art Immelman, that's when we're going to get into this conversation about evil as a concrete force in the universe. And P.S., just letting you know, this was a thing that your old friend Katie Rosenson and I would always get into it about in classes, because my upbringing teaches exactly that evil actually is a concrete force in the universe. And somehow Katie didn't see it that way. And so we would go back and forth. And ultimately, if we believe evil is a concrete force, then Donovan, do we even have a shot at control? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we hold, you know, this is what I think, like capitalism, for it to function, pushes evil aside,
Yes.
but then becomes its own evil, because it's taken to extremes, I guess. But
Yeah. Which I'm just going to point this out because he said it so beautifully, which I think is partly why Walker Percy invokes the institution of slavery so much in this novel, that you know, the whole institution of slavery is based on a burgeoning capitalism in America. And so, you know, I teach this class with my historian friend, and the way he kind of approaches this is he goes, here's the deal. This is called contingency theory in history. The thing about American slavery is that the forces sort of come together in such a way that it was the most effective way to build up this American capital and American economy. And then you go, oh my gosh, talk about abstractions, right? Where is the evil in all of that? So I do want you to keep this in your head, because as we move forward in this book, John Bailey, that becomes a central question. No matter how Tom sees himself as an inventor and a diagnostician and blah, 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 when he confronts what might be actual evil, are we working in, and you hear this echoed in so many places in the novel, are we actually working here in a metaphysical universe rather than a concrete universe? And that becomes a kind of big deal as we move forward in this book. So y'all, it still brings me to this essential question: evil, the devil, a concrete force, I don't know, the absence of goodness. Okay, then what is the love of Christ? How do y'all define it? You Presbyterians must have a lecture on this.
Well, I mean, Christ is the embodiment, the enfleshment of all that is good.
Okay.
all that is sacrifice.
Okay, good.
That's the other side of it, is it not?
This is really good, y'all. Man, that Walker Percy hurts my head. Yes. So here we go. If love, as Christ lives it, embodies it, teaches it, if it is sacrificial, is that what Tom has to recognize as he moves forward? But then, Guy, if the love of Christ is sacrificial, that is, you have to move outside of self, right? And in these relationships, and we're going to get into those more next time, with these women that he, you know, puts into the Howard Johnsons, we don't get a sense as we move through the first part of the novel that Tom is remotely sacrificial or has a sense of self that he loves. Does the love of self match up with the love of Christ in some way? Ooh, that's hard.
Now,
Yeah, that's hard. I don't think we get it this early in the novel anyway.
No.
at least 50 years ago, we had someone in a young adult Sunday school class teaching from the divinity school. And he said that sin is the assertion of self to the hurt of other selves without regard to the supreme self.
Oh, that's
So-
nice.
So that touches all of the bases of this issue, at least for me. And that has obviously stuck with me for
No kidding.
a long time, but
I want you to type that and send it to me, John Bailey. Will you do that?
if I can, yes, yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Because
Could you state it one more time?
Sin is the assertion of self to the hurt of other selves without regard to the supreme self.
okay. So
But
what's the
what
what's the
in my
supreme self?
mind-
Oh,
Well,
I'm sorry,
that's-
Dana. You go first.
Yeah, you all can answer that, but
What
That'd be
pops to my
God.
mind is Bernard of Clairvaux's four loves. The number 3 love is loving God for self's sake. And that's not what, you've got to love yourself for God's sake before you get to the end of it. And I have to stop and think, oh dear, am I loving God because it benefits me?
Oh my gosh, I could not be in love with you people more. Yes, this is all so hard, right? And part of the reason, despite how icky Tom is so often, is that he is able to raise these questions. And John, do you remember in this section when he has that conversation about sin and guilt and how he talks about the ways in which sadly he doesn't feel guilt, but he thinks he should feel guilt, and that somehow guilt is an essential quality or an essential feeling if you are going to be a human / religious person.
Amen.
Yeah, and then I mean, it's one of my it's so fascinating, that whole because that goes right in with love and evil, right?
Yeah.
What does sin actually mean, and what does guilt actually mean?
Mhm.
Because so much, and this is part of what he's satirizing, I think, brilliantly, not just with Doris, but the people around him, are the ways in which we try to avoid
Right.
coming to terms with or embracing those very human.
I mean, that's part of Percy's whole project, is it not?
Yes.
Thanatos syndrome, the same way.
Yes.
Let's put some saltpeter in the water to kind of minimize our emotions.
Right.
What is this depression saying about this world that we're living in right now? Yeah.
Yes. And when we talk about Walker Percy in scholarship, we call this, and I'll put this here as we move towards the ending, because I want you to kind of think about it as you move forward. The ways in which Percy consistently investigates or shows all the ways in which we defer to experts in our culture, particularly those experts who are trying to heal us in some way. So one of the things he's totally taking apart is the whole love clinic thing, right?
yes.
Which is so icky and diagnostic and medicinal.
I think it's wonderful.
And Sue, in the love clinic part, they have an expert that can help them on the one-on-one part. They know about the mechanical part, but we have, fortunately for us, an expert on the human part of this, the human equation, and it's Dr. Tom.
Yeah. Yes. And now everybody keeps trying to hire him, right?
And we know him, and Tom, you're awful.
Yes. And I think this is a huge thing that Percy sees in the 20th century, right? He's writing the book, late 60s, beginning of the 70s, this idea that we're searching in all the wrong places, but in some ways we're searching not to grapple with those fundamental human, sometimes inexplicable things like good, evil, sin, redemption. So I feel really bad. So I'll go to a psychologist. Yes. I feel really sad. So I'll go to a counselor of some kind, or I'll go back to school, or I'll start getting a bunch of girlfriends in a sports car. And so he's showing all the ways in which what happens is we kind of anesthetize ourselves to these really hard human questions that, y'all, really do make us feel bad, right? I mean, guilt makes us feel bad. Sin makes us feel bad. And what we're missing so often is, okay, how do we get to the redemptive part?
You're muted.
Right? One of the things, go ahead, John.
I just have to say, and this is a good time to say it because there's no way to answer this, I don't think. But I think in effect that Walker Percy is saying to us, amongst many things, but that we tend to view all of these issues as separate, and yet everything
Yes.
is connected. And
100%.
and that's really problematic if everything is connected, because there is so much of that is beyond an individual's control.
Yes. And that goes right back to what Donovan has been saying, right? It also, can y'all, Dana reminded me of this earlier when she said, you know, this thing about defining it. There's so much in that connectedness. There's so much in this novel that reminds me of Robert Penn Warren, right? All the King's Men. Here's one last thing I want to talk about before we go and then move forward in the novel, because we got to see what happens. But in terms of these difficult concepts, redemption is one that we have to grapple with moving forward, but also forgiveness. In this section of the novel, Tom makes clear that the real difficulty in his marriage was that they could not forgive each other. So we have to think about, when we deal with these really hard things like evil and sin and lust and all the things that are going on in this novel, what is forgiveness? Which is also a really hard question to answer. And in some ways, and this is where the secular or scientific humanism breaks down, you know, forgiveness is grace. Yeah. And how does that play out?
You're right on there, Sue, and I think that issue very much implicates the whole metaphysical versus the physical.
Yes.
And how those two ideas operate. You've got the Cartesian model, but then you've got whatever the other is, and it's really difficult if they are all connected.
Y'all, I am so happy only because this is the first Zoom class I've had today that actually made me really happy. And here's the thing, and I've told you all this before. This is exactly the kind of book I love because it is messy. It is super difficult, but the questions it raises, if we're willing to sort of put ourselves in this vulnerable space, the questions about love and sin and forgiveness are the essential things that not only make us human, but also make us perhaps worthy of this thing called grace. And so as we move forward, and so for next time, let's see if we can, hold on, let me look at my book real quick. All right, how many weeks do I have left, guy?
3.
Oh, awesome, July 2nd. Now, all of you need to spend a little time thinking about these hard issues, but then remember that I love you and everything's going to be fine.
Well, in several of his interviews, Percy talked about the fact that it's almost impossible to talk about this religious dimension. And so in almost all of the books, the protagonist doesn't figure it out until the very end. Sometimes they log. And so you spend this whole time wrestling around with all this stuff. You keep asking us to come up with the answers. And even
I know. I want you to help me. But you're right. And y'all, what's so fascinating, and Richard is so right. What's so fascinating is that, as a group of people who define themselves as Christians, in some ways, it's the hardest thing to explain. Yes. But we have to see if we can find ways of talking about it. Everything you just said, Richard, is so right. All right, y'all. Just see if you can figure all of that out by next week so you can explain it to me clearly. Donovan, I hope you feel better.
Feeling
All right,
great.
you guys. All right. That is adorable. All right, y'all. I love you. I'll see you next week in person, hopefully. Have a great week, okay? Forgive.
Right.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, Sue. Bye.
You're welcome.